Today I wanted to talk about my passion for knitting. People kind of make fun of me for my knitting, and they also, I'm going to immediately sidetrack from knitting to cheesecakes and just tell this little anecdote. So for many years around the holiday season, I would make 30 or 40 cheesecakes. And I had this little motto, which was keep the oven full so there's no room for your head. Because the truth is, I hate holidays, just hate them. So anyway, this one December, I made all these cheesecakes, and then I went to see my therapist and tell her goodbye because I was moving away for a few months. And during the session, I told her about how I make so many cheesecakes, and she said, well, that's OCD, and if you don't want to make cheesecakes, it's okay, you can stop making cheesecakes. And I was like, really? And then I said, and here's your cheesecake. So then I moved away, and my mail got forwarded to me, and there was this thank you card in the mail from my therapist. And she said, well, I just wanted to let you know that cheesecake was delicious, and I know I told you you don't need to make them ever again, but if you do decide to make them next year, I hope you'll keep me on the list. And so what the hell does that have to do with knitting? Well, I knit kind of all the time, pretty much all the time. And I'm pretty well known for knitting. People will both tease me and request that I knit things for them. And I love knitting things for people. Don't get any ideas. I'm all full up right now. But I've made some really fun things for people, and I'm going to give examples of that here in a minute. Anyway, so I started knitting in 1986 in November. It started in a really very sad way. I'd had a miscarriage. I was very depressed, and I have one of my sisters is a knitter, and she said, I'm going to teach you to knit, help you get your mind off of your grief. So she did teach me to knit, and that first project, which was a scarf, it really reflected my the stress I was feeling. It was knitted very tightly. It didn't turn out very well. I gave it to a friend of mine, and then I stopped knitting. I think it was just too much of an association with sadness. So that was 1986. 14 years later, knitting was making this trendy comeback. And I decided I wanted to knit again, and somebody heard me say that and left on my front porch this pamphlet, How to Knit, and some purple acrylic yarn and some aluminum needles. And those of you who are knitting snobs, like I'm kind of a knitting snob now, acrylic yarn and aluminum needles aren't necessarily like the ideal components with which to work, but I didn't care. I used that pamphlet, my hands remembered how to knit, and I started knitting this really, really long purple thing. And people would say, what are you knitting? And I would say, well, I'm knitting a cigarette, because I was using knitting to quit smoking until I figured out you can be a knitter and a smoker. But it worked for a while. Anyway, so I knitted and I knitted and I knitted. And then, I've just kept right on knitting. And so now I'm going into year 20 or year 21. I always get the math gets a little thrown off. And knitting has just become this huge part of my life. I teach knitting. I've taught knitting to children. I've taught knitting to people in rehab. I've just taught knitting to random strangers. Whenever I'm traveling somewhere in the world, I'll track down a knit shop and try to make friends, and also just get some wool. Just as a that's my souvenir that I go after. I love going to knitting shops. Anyway, today I wanted to just show some of my knitting accoutrements. Because a really fun big part of knitting is all the stuff that you get to collect to go with it. So I've got here where to begin. I'm going to start with the books. The thing about knitting is, we think of knitting, we think of sweaters and blankets, and that's all well and good. I've knitted those things, but you can also knit things like you can knit your own dog. And this book, there are just so many ridiculous knitting books. Yeah, you can. I don't know if they have a Boston Terrier. So I have got a Boston Terrier, and I've got a Great Pyrenees. It would take a long time to knit a Great Pyrenees. And then I've got a blue Lacey. I don't think any of those dogs are in here, but these are just some of the dogs. And then, this is a book of dog sweaters, And I recently knitted a really cool sweater for a dog friend of mine, and it made me laugh. It was so fun. I bought like the most expensive, high quality wool that I could. I think it was it cashmere and wool or Angora and wool? It was some like crazy high-end yarn, and I just loved it. It felt so good on my hands. And look, there's a Boston Terrier. And I went to the beach, and I kind of brought a little work with me to do, but instead of working on anything, I just worked on that dog sweater, and I binge listened to podcasts. And as I was doing that, I thought, this is how I want to spend the rest of my life. I just want to knit and listen to podcasts at the beach. I don't want to do anything else. I'm kind of an extreme thinker like that. So this one, I actually have two. I have another book that kind of goes with this one, and I can't find it. But this one is called Dominatrix, and it has in it, the other one I can't find is called Naughty Knits, which is like knitted lingerie. I think that sounds very uncomfortable and not very functional. As functional as lingerie is. But like, let's see. Make It Hurt So Good. Okay. Let's find, okay, so this is like a knitted corset because that's Victoria's other secret. That's Victoria's winter secret. And, well, here, look, there's a skull. I sometimes will knit images into my work, but not too often. All right, so let's look at this. This is called the Winged Heart Bralette. Now, seriously, it just doesn't seem very practical to me. I'm really practical when it comes to foundation garments, granny panties, that sort of thing, jog bras. Do we have any other good examples in here? And then there's the Jughead hat. I like that for the women. There's ridiculous stuff that won't hold your boobs up. And then for the men, there's the Jughead hat, because nothing says sexy like your man dressing up like Jughead. And then this one, this is actually a favorite of mine. It's called Knitted Cakes. And I have knitted a cupcake before. I might have knitted a piece of cake. But the thing that I most often knit from this book is I love to knit donuts, right? So I'm just going to show you what I mean by that. I happen to have a, oh look, and then I've got my my leg warmers. You can really knit anything. So I happen to have, this is, it just kind of looks like not much of anything. But what happens is if you carry stuffing around in your pocket like I do, you just put the stuffing in here, and then you kind of move it around like this, and then voila, we have a knitted donut. And then what I would do is, I wish I could just pop off camera and do this and then pop back on camera, but you can use your imagination. So then I'll sew this part together, and then I can, and I sew these glass bugle beads on top, and they look like little sprinkles, or jimmies as we called them when I was growing up. And it's just cool. It's cool. So I've got a few other knitting things I want to show you. Gosh, I love this so much. So once you move on from purple acrylic yarn from like Michaels or Hobby Lobby, and then you start learning, or I should say I start learning about stuff, then I get really into it. Like I want to know if I can meet the animals from which the fiber is coming. That makes me really happy. And I actually met the goats this Angora came from, or mohair. I can't remember if the goats are called Angora and then you call the fiber mohair. Yes, I think that's right. But anyway, I had this friend, Lisa. She used to live in Texas. She moved away. But she had this goat farm, and I would go visit her. And she actually hand sheared her goats. She spun this wool, and it's held together. When I knitted it, this won't make sense to those of you who aren't knitters. And if you're not a knitter and you're watching, well, anyway, you deserve not to know. So what I did with this is I held it together with some yarn that I purchased, because this was just a single ply fiber, and it would kind of fall apart. I didn't use an actual pattern. I just invented my own pattern, and I'm just going to put it on here. This is so warm. If you wear something like this out in public, you need to prepare yourself for everything from stunned looks and people running away from you to people running up to you and wanting to pet you. And it does, it smells a little still like goats, not too much, but it definitely attracts dogs. I think I'm just going to leave this on. I love it. So there's a trend going on now. It started a couple years ago. I'm just going to reach over here, and that is gigantic wool. Isn't this funny? It doesn't even look real, right? So I once posted a photo of myself holding this in a yarn shop, and I said, this is what I want. And like 2 hours later, my friend Jordan showed up. He went and bought it for me. So I have to be careful what I wish for, because it was really sweet of Jordan, and I love him. I love him anyway, but I extra love him for getting me this. It's also not cheap, so it set him back quite a bit. But he got it for me, and I love it so much that I got some more. Here, these are the needles we use for that wool. These are like motorcycle handles. And I made this. Oh my gosh, it's so heavy. It's like a weighted blanket for anxiety. I might just keep this on too. This is as impractical as a bralette, but it's kind of fun. And I'm getting ready to have my room completely redone and turned into sort of a cabin. And I think this will be one of the signature pieces that I use when I redecorate. Oh my gosh, if I can lift it up. So I also want to talk about how sometimes knitting goes awry, at least my knitting. Even when I think I'm following a pattern, I totally have the ability to fuck up royally. And I have this friend, Rachel. She's an amazing knitter. Like, she's incredible. And whenever she comes over to knit, and she makes me get this sweater out, and then she laughs for about an hour straight. And I think that's why I'm never going to get rid of this sweater. I saw the pattern for it in Vogue Knitting. The wool I got in Canada from this place called Cottage Craft, which was like the first, they started the first cottage industry for women in Canada, like in the 20s. So women could make money at home, knitting things and then selling them, and so bring in some income for the family. Anyway, this is very scratchy wool, and scratchy wool always reminds me of Rufus Wainwright's mother, Kate McGarrigle. Okay, let me just back up and say this is another thing I love about knitting. I love knitting trivia. Like, the rabbit hole of knitting is like the rabbit hole of so many other pastimes. You just find out more and more. So when Kate McGarrigle died several years ago, and the New York Times magazine did an obituary of her, of all the things they could mention, her amazing music career, her sister, then they did mention many things, but of all the things they could mention, they mentioned that she was an avid knitter and that she loved working with scratchy wool, like that was traditional. So when I was in Canada, which is where Kate McGarrigle's from, I was up in the Maritimes, and I got this wool at this shop. And it's so scratchy and uncomfortable. It's just wonderful. But anyway, when I knitted it, somehow I put the sleeves in the wrong place. And I think it might, this might actually fit my Great Pyrenees Norris. Like, this might actually, I could put it on him, but I don't think he would like it. Anyway, Rachel, if you're watching, this one is for you. And that also reminds me, like, another thing that knitting has brought into my life is a lot of famous people knit. And I used to do a blog for the Hill Country Weavers, which is a wonderful knitting shop in Austin. And during South by Southwest one year, Kelly Deal was coming to town, Kelly Deal of the Breeders, and she's got another band, R-Ring. And she's a big time knitter. So I got to book Kelly Deal playing an unofficial gig. And Kelly Deal and I became friends. And so now whenever she plays, I'll go see her. I flew into Philly once to see her. And then afterwards I go backstage and we talk about what have we been knitting. So it's really funny. To me, it's really funny. I've just got a couple more things I want to show. So so I made a big mistake on this one, but here's the thing. Isn't that beautiful? I must say I'm pretty proud of this. But the mistake, which I'm not even going to show you, maybe some of you can see it. Actually, I can't even see it anymore. The thing is, I knitted the mistake all the way around over and over again, and so it became what we like to call an element of design. Look at this centerpiece. This is so great. I think this came from an Elizabeth Zimmerman pattern, and She's like the queen of knitting. She's no longer with us, but she's with us in spirit. And then this, okay, so another thing about knitting is when you meet the people that make the fibers. So this is, my friend Gina used to have a business called, why am I forgetting it? I'm forgetting it. But she would hand dye this stuff, and it's so fancy, and then you dry it over like a fire. And I just got a precious little, just enough to make this, I think this is a feather and fan pattern, but I love, like, it's just so cool in the light, you know? That's what I think. And then I'm just gonna show this, well, I've got 2 more pieces to show. Okay, so this is one of my favorite pieces. I'm gonna have to take the goat off so I can put this one on. When I went to Buenos Aires several years ago, it turns out I was in a cab, and the cab driver is asking me in broken English, how do you like the wine in Argentina? And I said, well, I don't drink wine. And he's like, well, how do you like the meat? And I'm like, no carne, I'm vegetarian. And so basically he said, well, why did you come to my country? And I said, I think the word is lana is maybe it. That's Spanish for yarn, something close to that. And the thing is, there's a whole street in Buenos Aires that is full of yarn shops. So I went into this shop, and I, in my very, very broken Spanish, I mean broken, like beyond broken, I sort of conveyed that I wrote a blog about knitting, and they got very excited, and they took me into the back room, and they gave me this wonderful tour, and it was just fabulous. But anyway, I bought this yarn, which is called roving. It's very lightly spun, and it has. Again, I didn't use a pattern. I used really big needles. I made this in about 2 days, and the thing about it, it weighs about, I don't know, probably 10, 15 pounds. It was so big I couldn't fit it in my suitcase on the way home, so I had to wear it through the airport and back to Austin. And the weather was very warm, so I mean I was just dying. But I really have this vivid memory of the young people who worked in security, like stopping me. Again, everybody wanted to touch it. So if you want to make friends, you can make and wear really strange knitted items. I can teach you. And so the last thing I wanted to show about my knitting, well, 2 things. So this is, I talk about how it's fun to collect stuff. I made this my own self in a ceramics class. It says Holy Sheep on this side, and then it actually has some sheep on this side. And I made it to hold my knitting needles. I'm telling you, there's like no end to the things that you can do. So the last thing I want to show you is I once bought this kit to make a Cowichan sweater. That's a Canadian sweater. And I made it for my friend Bart, so I don't have it here. But anyways, a friend of mine, I think she saw that sweater, and she said to me, I really want you to make a sweater for my grandfather clock. And as it happens, this particular friend starred in a TV show called The Nanny, and her character was Cece Babcock. So this project came to be known as the Cece Babcock Clock Sock, which if you say that even 2 times fast, it's going to sound like a porno movie. Anyway, this took me a really long time to knit, so long, in fact, that by the time I finished it, the clock had broken. And so I get to keep this, and wait, let me see. Oh, here's the opening. Hang on a second. Sometimes I like to put it on like as if I am a grandfather clock. Let me see if I can do this. Hang on a second. This is really super ridiculous. Okay, I'll be back in a second. Let's see. Okay, so here I am. And this is kind of like this project I saw on the internet, which is called, oh, wait a minute. Oh, here it is. It's like a sweater for introverts. So you can, which I am. So you can just like go like that, and then hopefully nobody will bother you. So that is just the beginning of my knitting life, and I look forward to sharing more knitting adventures with you. Thanks. Hey y'all, thanks a lot for tuning in. I hope you'll like and subscribe to my channel. And if you like this episode, I hope that you'll copy this link, share it with a friend, paint it on a wall, put it on your social media. That'd be great. Thanks a million. Take it easy.